For those of you who've just joined, we just finished the CAN board meeting, and I've given all the board members a whopping 2 minutes to get a drink and take care of themselves. And I see that our speaker has signed in, so we'll probably start up at a minute or two past 6. Hey, Emily.
Hey, good evening.
So we ran right up to like a minute before 6 o'clock in our board meeting. So I gave everybody just a 2-minute break. So we'll start up as soon as all these names turn into faces.
Hey, Emily, it's good to see you.
Hey, how are you doing?
Good. Had COVID, got over it, and I'm back in the saddle again.
I had a similar experience a couple months ago. It was a doozy. It's good to be on the other side.
Amen.
I'm in the ever dwindling population of COVID virgins.
I mean, I hope this isn't true, but it's probably coming for you.
I'm
for
hoping the new boosters are gonna let me leak on just a wee bit longer.
I wouldn't wish that off on my world's worst enemy. If I didn't have the fever and the sore throat and stuff, but just no energy. It felt like my feet were in concrete. And it was everything I could do to walk across the room. It just is that. And you know me, I gotta be doing and going and nosing and doing stuff I do, and I can't. It drove me up the wall. I'm just glad it's behind me, and I certainly don't want to ever have to have that again.
For the folks who have joined, this meeting is recorded. Usually a day or so after the meeting is over, we get it uploaded to YouTube and then posted back to the CAN website and meeting notes and minutes, so that if you know of people who were unable to attend, or if you want to go back and review any of this to recall details, that should be available before the week is out. Let's see. One more minute, and then we will start up again. I have shared, I've shared the, how many questions do we end up with, Emily? 25 questions with Emily. She'll be trying to cover those in her slides to some degree, but we should certainly have time at the end if we've missed anything. I might try to keep score on the side as we go. Okay. Emily, why don't you introduce yourself, and then when you're ready, you just tell me and I'll start sharing slides.
Okay. I'm pretty ready if you want to get going, but I'm glad to be with you all. I'm Emily Ball at the City of Asheville. I am the Homeless Strategy Division Manager. That's a new position for us here at the city and a new division for us. We are a division, and I'm saying we, but this is only me at the moment, but we have some help on the way. We have 3 positions that are posted right now to really build out our staff capacity to better respond to homelessness in the community. Homeless Strategy Division is a component of the Community and Economic Development Department led by Nikki Reed here at the city. I've been at the city for 2.5 years. I started 2 months before the pandemic, so hell of a time to change positions, but it's been very good to be here. Prior to that, I was at Homeward Bound for almost 10 years, so I'm certainly familiar with work around homelessness in our community. and have been excited to move from the agency level to the community level and working with other community partners who are delivering services to the same population in the last couple of years. So I am excited to be in this position, excited about the work that we have ahead of us, and glad to be here with you all tonight.
All right, great, thanks. So in the agenda, there are links to these slides, and there's also links to the large amount of detail related to the point in time count. I knew that there were a lot of questions about point in time count, so I asked Emily to include those details. That would be more for reference material. She'll not be going through all those slides here tonight. So I'm going to get us started, and I will be Emily's slide advancer. So take it away.
Great. Well, I'm sure you all have seen the slides already. I am going to run through these. Certainly feel free to interject with questions along the way, and I expect that we'll have a good conversation afterwards. So just wanted to give you sort of a general update on the state of homelessness in our community and the work that we are focused on right now. Next slide. So I know that you all are a very engaged group of folks, so some of this will be repeat information for you, but I hope that this will be useful. So I always like to start by talking about why people are homeless in our community. I think there were some questions along those lines and what you submitted to Rick. So first, housing costs are the only known indicator of rates of homelessness across the country. That's based on research in communities across the country. Certainly, we can identify commonalities in folks who experience homelessness. A lot of those things include disabilities, include mental health disorders, substance use disorders, lack of employment, et cetera. But housing costs are the only known indicator of rates of homelessness in a community. And so what that means is that in communities that have a ready supply of affordable housing, I'm not sure that we have any of those communities in our country anymore, but in communities that have a good stock of affordable housing, you would expect to see a lower rate of homelessness in those communities, because if people have the ability to pay for housing and maintain that housing, they will do that. What I know from long experience is that the primary reason that folks become homeless is that they don't have a sufficient support system during a crisis, meaning that support system is either completely absent or is just inadequate. So all of those things that I just mentioned, unemployment, disability, mental health, substance use, those are things that happen to many people at some point in our lives. And if we have a strong support system when that occurs, we are not likely to lose housing. I am not that likely to lose housing in my lifetime. It certainly could happen. But I have a lot of stability in my life. I have a lot of strong family and friend relationships. I have a lot of resources to draw on. If I, was hit by a car and became disabled, lost my employment, needed long-term care, I have a pretty strong network that would likely support me through that crisis. When folks don't have that network in place, they are likely to lose their housing eventually. Once people lose their housing, it is very, very, very difficult to get back into housing. The barriers to getting back into housing just multiply exponentially. So very difficult to get employment if you're staying in a shelter that has specific entry times and times that you need to leave in the morning, or if you're staying in a car, staying outside and don't have access to clean clothing, don't have access to a shower, don't have consistent access to food. From there, I think things often really spiral. Often people experience violence when they're homeless. Often people lose their belongings. And by lose, I generally mean that people experience a lot of theft when they're homeless. It's really easy for people to lose their ID. Very, very impossible to regain employment or regain housing unless you have basic things in place like ID. So as soon as folks become homeless, everything just starts to get much more complicated. Certainly mental health and substance use disorders increase really dramatically once people have become homeless, which means the longer people are homeless, the heavier the lift is to get them back into housing and back to stability. Homelessness in our community is a regional issue. Of course, we are a regional hub for Western North Carolina. There are very limited resources for folks who lose housing. or have those types of crises in surrounding counties. So very few shelters, very few housing programs, really limited transportation. So people in Western North Carolina who are in that type of crisis are likely to end up in our community. We also, of course, have a really strong VA medical center here. So we do have folks who are veterans who are coming from across the country to receive services at that VA. And occasionally those are people who are homeless or who may not have housing when they, as they continue to be in our community. I want to just point out, I just state the obvious to you all that, homelessness is a crisis that really affects, it's a real trauma for people who are experiencing homelessness, but I know that homelessness affects our entire community. It affects all of us on this call. It affects the quality of life in our community, and that's true across the country. So in the past several years, certainly in our community in the pandemic, homelessness has really increased, but across the country, homelessness has just changed in the last several years. In 2020, so we do a count of folks who are homeless every year. You'll see this data in a minute. In 2020, across the country, it was the first time that people who are unsheltered was there were a higher number of folks who are unsheltered than the number of people in shelters or transitional housing. So what that means is that the nature of homelessness has been changing across the country, that the intensity and escalation of homelessness in terms of people's diagnoses and just in behaviors and barriers to regaining stability has increased across the country. And I don't have data on this, but I do know just anecdotally from talking with peer communities and talking with folks at conferences that most communities are seeing things that are similar to what we are seeing in our community, meaning an increase in unsheltered homelessness in particular as a result of the pandemic and after the pandemic. Next slide. So we have two primary sources of data relevant to homelessness. The first is the Homeless Management Information System, HMIS. This is a database that I manage at the city and that is used by service providers in our community, so nonprofits across the community who are working with homeless folks. Tracks demographic data, household characteristics, how people are engaging with community resources and what's happening as a result of that engagement. So for example, did you have health insurance when you entered my program? And then did I help you? If not, did I help you acquire health insurance? And then we're tracking that when you exit my program. It's looking at the kinds of things that are changing for people over the course of their interaction with services in the community. Programs that are funded by HUD are required to participate in HMIS. But otherwise, we don't have a lot of leverage to encourage participation. So my role in that is really to sort of build this culture with our service providers around the importance of data, encourage that buy-in and participation, and then provide some support to them so that they can meaningfully access that system. We have been getting increasing participation in that. When I first came to the city, we only had 4 agencies participating in HMIS. And now we have, I think, 9. So really significant increase in the last couple of years, still working on that. We still have some opportunities. We have some key service providers in our community who do not participate in HMIS, which means we don't have access to the data about who their clients are and what's happening while folks are engaged with them. We want to continue to be working on that. 2 big examples of that are the VA Medical Center. We don't have data on their outreach programs and on their housing programs. And the rescue mission is another big example of that. They don't participate in HMIS. So I'm working with both of those folks to encourage that participation, figure out some ways that we can integrate their data if they're not able or willing to access the system directly. Having that community-wide data is really essential for us in being able to evaluate the performance of individual programs and agencies in the community's service system overall. We certainly have opportunities to improve our community service system, and it's really important for us to get the data across the community so that we're clear on who's homeless, why they're homeless, what their needs are, and how we can better respond to those needs. The other important thing about data and HMIS is that we are required to submit reports to HUD annually to the federal government. directly from HMIS, and those reports partially determine the federal resources that are available to our community for homeless and housing programs. So really important that we paint a very clear picture to the federal government about what our needs are and who our population is, and how well our system is performing, so that we can continue to increase the amount of federal resources available to us. Next slide. The other primary source of data that we have is the point in time count. So in an ideal world, we would have all of our service providers participating in HMIS. They would all do a very good job with their data collection and data quality. And we would be able to pull a point in time count any day of the year. We would be able to say, today, how many folks are homeless in our community and where are they across the community, and who are they? What are their characteristics? Because we don't have that community-wide participation in HMIS, I like to reference the point in time count, because I do think it is our most comprehensive data set around homelessness in the community, because we do have all agencies participate on this single night every year, and we have really robust effort to get street teams out in the community to identify folks who are unsheltered. So the point in time count is an annual count of everyone experiencing literal homelessness by HUD's definition. So that means people who are in emergency shelter, in transitional housing, or people who are unsheltered. Does not include people who might be doubled up. So if someone is sleeping on a friend's couch in public housing, for example, that person would not be included in this by definition. So point in time count works really just like a census. The federal requirement is that we conduct this count on a single night within the last 10 days in January every year. It's true for communities across the country. Informs resources available to us. I've already talked about that. Certainly the count does have limitations. It is not possible that we will identify every single person who's experiencing unsheltered homelessness. In particular, our emergency shelter and transitional housing counts should be very accurate, but it's highly likely that we're undercounting the number of folks who are unsheltered. It's just not realistic that we could identify everyone. I will say in the last few years, we've really improved our methodology on that front. Years ago, the approach was, we've got 4 teams and you're on the East team, go East, count people. Like, that is not good enough. That is not, that's not meaningful methodology. And so in the last couple of years, we've really honed in on that, so that we have teams that are assigned to very specific geographies with a map. These are the boundaries within which you need to walk every street and, overturn rocks, look for all the folks who are within this really specific geography. So I do think our methodology improvement has made a difference. The benefit of the point in time is that we are doing it similarly year after year. So always the end of January, always this big community count. So it can show us trends in our population over time. Next slide. So in this year's count, we conducted the 2022 count on the evening of January 25th. Generally, we have done the count on Tuesdays. On Wednesdays. We moved that this year to Tuesday so that we could connect with folks at Haywood Street's Welcome Table, which is a big lunch on Wednesdays. It's really certainly a hub for folks who are unsheltered in particular. And so a good opportunity for us to connect with people who we might have missed on the night of the count, to ask where they slept the night before and include their data. We had 48 volunteers who participated on 16 teams, and I'm calling them volunteers, but they were primarily homeless services staff, which I think is really a benefit in our community. It means that they know who to be looking for and where to be looking and how to approach folks and how to have those conversations. And we also had 7 city staff across multiple departments who participated in that count. We pulled the data for the point in time count directly from HMIS for shelters and transitional housing programs that are participating in HMIS. And then for other locations and for the unsheltered count, we have folks who are filling out paper surveys. And then all of this come to me. We enter that data directly into HMIS so that the system can do its job and deduplicate and aggregate the data for us and provide that report that we can then share out with the community and with HUD. The survey questions on the point in time count are asking about demographic information, history of homelessness, household composition, and characteristics. And by characteristics, I mean things like veteran status, for example. This year, a change that we made was to ask some supplemental questions of folks who were unsheltered. Certainly, you know, again, big increase in unsheltered homelessness in our community during the pandemic. And so a clear need to better understand that, to better understand who is unsheltered and why. So we asked some additional questions of those folks. It is important to note that participation in the point in time count is voluntary. Certainly it's not possible to compel people to do that. We are always working on incentives for participation and really trying to do a good job engaging people so that we get the best data possible. But participation is voluntary, which means people can decline to participate altogether or can decline to answer a particular question. Next slide. So this year, this is just a picture of whose data were included in the point in time count this year. So again, shelter, transitional housing, and unsheltered folks are who are included here. The results this year included shelter data from the Rescue Mission, Salvation Army, Helpmate, Trinity Place, which you may not be familiar with, is a 6-bed emergency shelter for children that actually closed in the spring. Haywood Street Respite, the Ramada, Homeward Bound had also been running a non-congregate shelter for veterans that was included. And then Code Purple sites. Code Purple, I'm sure you're all familiar with, is our community's cold weather initiative to open additional shelter capacity when the temperature is at 32 degrees or below. Transitional housing programs whose data are included are ABCCM, so that's both the Veterans Restoration Quarters and Transformation Village. Elida has an 8-bed transitional housing program for youth ages 16 to 25. Swananoa Valley Christian Ministry has a transitional housing program for moms and children. And then the unsheltered count included AHOPE and Haywood Street. And in both of those cases, that means we had folks the day after the count asking people where they slept the night before so that we were sure that we weren't double counting people. School system liaisons, both Buncombe County and Asheville City school systems have dedicated staff whose job is to identify homeless kids and connect them and their families with resources. APD participated in the count. And then again, we had those 48 volunteers on those 16 street teams. So I feel like our count this year was good. I think it was a really strong effort and a pretty comprehensive effort, particularly compared to the past. Next slide. Results this year is surprise to no one. We had an increase in homelessness compared to 2021. So 21% increase in the total number of people who are homeless compared to January of 2021. What we saw in that is that the sheltered population declined slightly, but the number of unsheltered individuals doubled. And unsheltered folks are, sleeping on sidewalks and doorways, sleeping in tents, sleeping in camps, but also would include people who are sleeping in their cars or abandoned buildings, any place that is not intended for human habitation. I included our last few years of data here just to sort of show you the impact of the pandemic over time. So if you look at our 2020 count, again, this happens in January, so this is a couple months before the pandemic began, and for us anyway. And so it is reasonable to look at that 2020 data as our pre-pandemic baseline. That's kind of business as usual in our community. That those are the numbers that have been fairly similar for us in years past prior to the pandemic. So in that 547 people total, 65 of whom were unsheltered. If you look at the 2021 data, that unsheltered number came close to doubling, increased to 116. And then between 2021 and 2022, that number again doubled. So 232 people who were unsheltered in 2022, and a total count of 637 people identified as experiencing homelessness. Next slide. This is a snapshot of who's homeless in our community, again, based on that point in time data. So vast majority of folks who are homeless here are single individuals. We don't have a large homeless family population. We certainly do have some homeless families, but 92% of our folks this year were single individuals. Majority of folks who are homeless in our community are white, 74% are white. However, 74% is significantly lower than the general population of people who are white in Buncombe County. So definite disproportionate representation of people of color in our homeless population. 20% in this year's point in time count were people who identify as Black, 6% Asian, American, Indian, or multiple races. The majority of folks in our community who are homeless are men, 69% men. And then 33% of folks in this year's count were identified as chronically homeless. And this is a high priority population for us and for the federal government. Chronic homelessness has a federal definition. That means people have been literally homeless. So again, shelter, transitional housing, or unsheltered for at least 12 months, and they have a disability. There's some additional technicality to that, but that's the basic picture. In this year's count, 33% of folks were chronically homeless. So what that means is that as housing becomes less affordable, people are staying homeless longer, things are more complicated for them, that chronic population is increasing, which then means it is a much heavier lift to get those folks back into permanent housing. 24% of people in this year's count were veterans, and 5% of people in the count were youth. And that's, again, following that same age bracket that I mentioned for LIDA. So ages 16 to 25 is the youth population that HUD looks at. Next slide. I am going to stop there actually for a minute and ask if you all have questions about any of that data.
Anybody? Okay.
All right, city's role when it comes to homelessness. So the city, of course, provides a number of core services in the community that often intersect with people who are homeless or with the effects of homelessness in our community. So planning, development services, sanitation, APD, certainly. In North Carolina, as I'm sure you know, counties by legislation provide health and human services, social work services, adult protective services, behavioral health, public health, economic services. The county is not a provider of any of those. The city is not a provider of any of those, again, by legislation. The city does facilitate federal and, of course, general fund funding available to homeless service providers. So those are things like the Community Development Block Grant and home funding, which are both federal HUD funds. Housing Trust Fund, which of course is local funding. As you know, the city is not a direct service provider of homeless services, but the city does serve as the lead agency for the North Carolina 501 Asheville Buncombe Continuum of Care. So that's a key role in any community. It's a key role in our community, and in our community, the city does have that designation. Next slide. Continuum of care. So this is a federal framework for building and resourcing community collaboration to end homelessness. The idea here is that at the federal level, HUD has designated all of these geographies across the country. There are 407 different geographies that are each a distinct continuum of care. And the concept is that you're looking at homelessness and at your homeless service system within that designated geography. So you're looking at inflow into homelessness, how long people are staying homeless and what their interaction with services is, and then outflow from that closed system within that defined geography. Does that make sense? Okay. Also within that geography, every continuum of care has a lead agency, a designated lead agency. And that lead agency facilitates annual federal HUD funding for homeless and housing programs, is responsible for data collection and reporting through the Homeless Management Information System, and then supports continuum of care governance, which creates policy and strategy related to how to improve the homelessness response in the community and decrease occurrences of homelessness across the continuum of care. In our community, for the continuum of care, our geography is Buncombe County. City of Asheville is that continuum of care lead agency. The federal HUD funding that we facilitate is about $2 million a year to support homeless and housing programs. And our Continuum of Care Governance Board is the Homeless Initiative Advisory Committee, HIAC, which is jointly appointed by City Council and County Commissioners. This is a joint board of both the city and the county. HIAC is responsible for kind of regular functions related to advisory capacity for local government policy, but also is designated as the Continuum of Care Governance Board. So that means, for example, HIAC will be making decisions about funding recommendations of that $2 million in HUD funding through a very prescribed process from HUD. Based on those HIAC recommendations, I will submit that application to HUD for that $2 million in funding for final decision-making at the federal level. But HIAC serves as the kind of local decision-making body about what our community priorities are. Next slide. So again, we are looking at the homeless service system within this closed geography. So the idea is that we're looking at who is our homeless population within this geographic area and what do they need? How do we develop a system that responds to their needs in particular? So for example, we don't have a large family population in our homeless family subpopulation in our homeless population. It therefore doesn't make sense for our service system to have a huge amount of resources for homeless families, since that's not the primary demand of the population that we have. So wanting to have a really well-developed homeless service system that is responsive to the needs in our community. This is a basic map of how a homeless service system ought to work in any continuum of care across the country. First of all, obviously, ideally, we're preventing homelessness whenever possible to keep people stable in their existing housing. So people have, if they're in housing, but they are being evicted or they have lost income and gotten behind on their rent, it is certainly a high impact strategy to provide the support that they need to keep them stable in that particular unit so that they don't lose housing in the first place. When people do lose housing, ideally, we are able to divert them from homeless services by quickly resolving that crisis. And what I mean by that is the way that I think about diversion is that it's what any of us on this call would do for someone in our lives who lost their housing. So I don't know you all, you don't know me, but I imagine that, if you had a close friend or a relative who lost their housing, I don't think your first move would be to give them the phone number for the rescue mission, but instead you would try to problem solve that situation with them. So help them identify, do they have any friends they might be able to stay with? What resources do they need in order to not go to the rescue mission? That's the concept of diversion. How can we catch people before they have fallen too deeply into homelessness and really resolve that housing crisis very early on? Often that looks like providing transportation back to stay with a family member if people have that option, or just some kind of relatively minimal assistance that can resolve that crisis. For people who have already become homeless, we want to have coordinated and solutions focused outreach. So outreach that is really digging in with people where they are to identify a path out of where they are. So we want outreach to be more than, handing out socks or sack lunches and those kinds of things, but really problem solving with people to help identify their best path back into permanent housing. Ideally, we would have a variety of coordinated shelter options with enough inventory to fully meet emergency shelter needs. So that we wouldn't have people who are unsheltered, but instead we would have shelter options that meet the needs of folks in the community to provide a bed for every person who needs it. We also would have programs that are focused on exit planning as soon as people enter the program. So when folks are coming into shelter, immediately identifying the path out of shelter, what resources they need, and really proactively pursuing that. We also would have a variety of coordinated and right-sized and quality housing interventions with enough capacity to get people out of shelter quickly and help them stabilize in housing and not become homeless again. So a system that has some flow to it so that when people enter shelter, there's a clear pathway out of shelter with the rental assistance or the housing navigation or the employment supports that they may need in order to exit homelessness. And then underpinning all of that, of course, we would have really high quality data to measure how effective all of those interventions were and to guide any adaptations in that system based on what we learned from the data. And we would have a unified vision, a coordinated approach, and sufficient resources. If you looked ahead, you know, this is not the current state of our homeless response system in our community, but this is how a homeless service system ought to work if it is a high functioning homeless service system. Next slide. This is the way our current homeless service system works across our community's continuum of care. And this is just Emily Ball perspective that you're seeing on this slide here. So first of all, I do think that we have pretty strong prevention capacity in our community, and we have that at a number of levels. You know, we have Pisgah Legal working on eviction prevention. We have Eblin and ABCCM helping people when they've gotten behind on their rent or utility bills. We have Homeward Bound and Helpmate providing really targeted homelessness prevention. So people who have been homeless in the past and are within 14 days of losing their current housing are eligible for a homelessness prevention program. So really trying to pinpoint who is most likely to become homeless if they lose this particular housing. And then, of course, through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act, there's been a wealth of federal resources available as part of COVID response that have provided rental assistance to help people maintain their current housing. We do not have a lot of diversion happening. So when people have lost their housing and are first showing up at any of the programs across our community, we don't have many resources or a lot of kind of concerted effort and unified approach to help people problem solve that immediately rather than needing to enter that system. We certainly do have outreach capacity in our community. The city funds 2 outreach positions at Homeward Bound. The county funds an outreach position at Homeward Bound. The VA has some outreach staff. I can name a handful of others. So we do have some outreach capacity, but currently those folks don't have many resources to offer when they're out in the woods or out on the streets connecting with people that will actually help resolve the crisis that that person is experiencing. Very significantly, shelter inventory across our community decreased by 50% during the pandemic. That is very significant. It's a huge capacity cut for us in terms of just the number of beds that exist in our community. Those cuts happened as a result of providers really trying to do a good job with COVID protocol, trying to keep their clients safe, keep their staff safe. Certainly operations were very, very difficult for service providers during the pandemic. And so we didn't have any kind of large closures of programs, but we had a number of providers who decreased the beds that they had available, maybe cut a portion of their program, and all of those small cuts across the community added up to a 50% decrease in the overall inventory in the community. We also have minimal options for people who are not clean and sober or don't have state issued ID. A large number of people who are unsheltered in particular certainly are not currently in a place where they are close to clean and sober. Certainly some people are, but a lot of folks are really struggling with substance use disorders and therefore unable to access some of the sheltered beds that do exist in our community. We have really strong capacity to provide permanent housing for veterans and for people fleeing domestic violence. So a lot of resources available through the VA at the federal level, a large program for housing veterans at Homeward Bound and at the VA Medical Center. And then also Helpmate has a good amount of housing resource to support folks who are fleeing domestic violence. So those 2 subpopulations in particular, I think are well supported in terms of their ability to exit homelessness in our community. We have very, 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 very little capacity to house anyone else. So we do have other housing programs in the community. Homeward Bound, of course, is providing permanent supportive housing and rapid rehousing. But the inflow into those programs and into other housing programs in the community is extremely restricted, just not a large number of new resources to house new people. Part of what makes a permanent supportive housing program successful is that people stay housed, right? Like we don't want people to enter that program and then return to homelessness. But because people stay housed, that means the only way to have new inflow into those programs is to acquire new resources, because you're using your existing resources to continue to support the people that you already have. So really limited capacity to house anyone outside of veterans and people fleeing domestic violence. Major data limitations, but continually improving, as I talked about earlier. And certainly a lot of good work happening in the community, but not necessarily coordinated and not always moving in the same direction. Next slide. I mentioned this briefly at the beginning, but our department, Community and Economic Development, has restructured here at the city. In the past, we've had two divisions, a Community Development Division and an Economic Development Division. We have the same number of staff, but just have restructured. So are now 4 divisions, still Community Development, Equitable Economic Development, and then a newly created Affordable Housing Division and newly created Homeless Strategy Division. I said we have the same number of positions, but that's not actually true for the Homeless Strategy Division. We have had 2 staff positions in the past that have been dedicated to homelessness, and we will now have 4. So this is some new resources at the city reflecting council's strategic priority around houselessness and just some capacity expansion. So those 4 are my position, and then we have 3 jobs that are currently posted. One will focus on data and compliance, one on training and development, and that's really intended to help support service providers in building out their capacity and to develop new initiatives across the community. And then integrated health and housing. I imagine you all are aware that the city is receiving about $1.5 million in opioid settlement funding, and the county is receiving about $16 million in opioid settlement funding. Both of those are over many, many years. So this is not actually like a huge immediate infusion of resources, but is a new opportunity for some sustained effort in response to the opioid epidemic. Dogwood Health Trust made some funding available to local governments who were receiving settlement funds for planning work. And so we applied for some of that funding, and that has created a 2-year staff position. So that's that integrated health and housing position. That person will do the community planning work to develop a strategy for the city's use of opioid settlement funds. And we'll certainly work really closely with the county on that. You know, we are a relatively small community in one community, and we have one homeless population. We want to be sure that we're integrated with the efforts that are happening with the county. And I've already been participating in that, but we'll have this staff person co-lead a strategic planning process with Buncombe County staff related to opioid response in the community. Next slide. These are my goals for the division that we are building right now. So I said earlier that we have a lot of folks who are doing a lot of good work, but that is relatively disjointed. We have a lot of people moving in different directions. I think we have to work on that. And I think that's our job. That's our division's role, is to provide some leadership and convening around that. I also think we, again, as I had that slide about what an ideal service system would look like. In addition to that, what we have to have kind of around that is a clear structure for how decisions get made and how people are able to participate in that homeless service system and in development of the work that ends homelessness. I keep being in conversations with folks who say, like, we want a seat at the table. We are frustrated that we don't have a seat at the table. And my response is, we don't actually have that table. I don't see that we have that table in our community on homelessness. We have to build that. So we have to build the avenues and decision-making landscape for people to participate in how we do this work together. That process has to have high values around inclusion and transparency. And we also need to work on building out the capacity of our service system. You know, we clearly don't have all of the services that we need to respond to the folks who are in our community right now. It's our job, I think, to support service providers in expanding their inventory and their programming, developing these community level initiatives, and really serving in that convening role. For example, right now I'm coordinating a healthcare and homelessness work group, which is, we've got a lot of folks who are working on healthcare that ends up touching a lot of people who are homeless. We also have a lot of homeless service providers. We don't have a highly sort of integrated response, though. We have people who are really working on their own, or they may have sort of organic partnerships built just because they have a relationship with someone at another agency, but we don't have a systems approach, a system-wide response related to healthcare. So working on that, working on a similar work group around outreach. You know, we've got a lot of people doing outreach across the community, but not in a coordinated way and not in a strategic way. So I think that's the role of our division, is to pull some of those pieces together and so that we can collectively move things forward. Absolutely a goal of mine to improve our data on homelessness. We need that to be comprehensive. We need that to be quality. And then when we have quality data, we can use that to help drive performance improvements. So what are we getting right and what are we getting wrong? And how do we change what we're getting wrong so that we can have higher performing programs in our community, have more people exiting homelessness. Same with strategies and same with funding. And then integration and empowerment. So wanting to really develop strong partnerships. I think for me and for us at the city, certainly that includes the county and Dogwood. You know, as you all know, we have been working with them on this project with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I think that's a good launch point for us to continue to build out that relationship and to come together around homelessness. I really want all 4 of our positions to be really heavily integrated into the work that the community is doing. So really out and about, connecting with service providers, connecting with people who are experiencing homelessness. We have to continue to understand what's real in our community, what's true on the ground, so that we can be responsive to that. And certainly this is not work that 4 people can do. You know, 4 people is a big capacity expansion compared to where we have been. This is not work that 4 people can do alone. This is community work, but we need to be a really heavily integrated piece in that community work. And then lastly, community education and engagement. I am intending for us to regularly hold some community education opportunities, kind of a homelessness 101 once a month, a kind of topical Q&A with staff or some sort of discussion-based community forum once a month. I really want to be sure that we are creating pathways for people to participate in the solution. Again, this is not a problem 4 people can solve. This is a community-wide problem that we've got to come together to solve, but it's our job, I think, to help build out what some of those pathways are for people to take action. So I'm excited to have some additional folks joining this team and excited about the work that we have ahead of us. Next slide. In the meantime, it's only me, so keep that in mind as I go through current priorities. But first of all, a priority for me is just rebuilding trust and transparency. I think there has been a lot of we got a lot of work to do on that front. There have been a lot of concerns around both of those in the past for a number of different reasons related to a number of different activities and people who are involved. And I am working hard to rebuild some of that trust and transparency in the community. Would certainly invite any of you all to ask me anything you want to know and to have any conversation you want to have. I've just done the same thing with service providers. So the executive directors at our kind of key homeless service agencies, shelter and housing providers is generally what I mean by that. I recently, a week before last, had a meeting with that group and had a very similar conversation to say, like, we have got to be a team. We have got to figure out how to do this together. We have more in common than not. Let's figure out what that is and let's go forward. And if there's air that we need to clear from the past, I want to do that because I want us to have healthy and productive relationships so that we can get some work done. So building that unity and collaboration with that group in particular, but with a number of stakeholders across the community. Certainly a priority is immediate crisis response coordination. You know, we are in our community is in a bad spot right now. We've got a lot of folks who are outside. That's very complicated for all of us. That creates complications for every single person in our community. We have, you know, APD has really limited staffing right now. We're working at the city on how we can bring other departments in to kind of offset some of those challenges. And I am working specifically, again, working with leadership at service providers, but really working on, you know, how can we add some beds back? We lost 50% of our beds in the pandemic. Let's get those back online. You know, where are you at in rebuilding that inventory, and what support do you need? And what additional new partners can we have at the table to provide some additional capacity in the community? And then also, again, working with folks who are providing street outreach to identify ways that can be more coordinated, more strategic, identify what resources they might need that could have a more immediate, could be more immediately helpful to people who are outside. Obviously, a priority of mine is to fully staff the division. So all 3 of those positions are posted through September 6th, hoping to really get some strong folks in here. And then facilitate, you know, I mentioned that $2 million of HUD funding that we facilitate. I am just right in the thick of that right now. HUD has published those timelines. The continuum of care funding was just announced on August 1st and is due on September 30th. And that is an unreasonably tight timeline from HUD in this year. So that's challenging for agencies who are applying for that funding, and certainly challenging for me. And then the Emergency Solutions Grant funding is due October 3rd. So both of those are just a very high priority for me to preserve the funding that we have and renew the funding that we have for the coming fiscal year. I also am working on Code Purple planning for the upcoming winter season. We've had 1 meeting with that group so far. We meet again tomorrow. That group is shelter providers who have participated in Code Purple in the past. It is APD and the Sheriff's Office and the hospital and community paramedics. And it is the 2 new co-chairs of the Homeless Coalition, which is a group that meets monthly, open to anyone, includes a lot of service providers, a lot of direct service staff. So in that first planning meeting, I felt very encouraged. I think that we are going to have a good plan. I think we're going to have more capacity than we had last year. And I think we're going to have Code Purple options available much earlier than was true last year. So again, a second planning meeting tomorrow, and we should be able to share that plan, I would say, within the month. And then lastly, I have been very involved in the project with the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. We have, the city has contracted with them, thanks to some funding from Dogwood Health Trust, to do a needs assessment around unsheltered homelessness, followed by a set of strategies and recommendations about, you know, what do we do about the needs related to unsheltered homelessness in our community. I have just a lot of coordination in that project and have been working closely with them. That's been really wonderful for me to learn from them, and I am excited to get their results in the coming months. So current priorities for me, but again, I'm excited about where we're at. I'm excited about what we have in front of us. You know, we certainly have a lot of work to do, but I feel confident that is work that we can do. So although the present is relatively bleak and we have a lot of people who are outside and a lot of significant need in our community, I do think that we are beginning to get on a pathway that will make some difference and that will have a strong impact in the future. It was a lot of talking for me, so I will wrap up there. I appreciate you all sticking with me through that, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I know, Rick, you're going to look at those questions that were submitted. I'm sure there are some that I didn't hit in that.
You want to just sort of walk through these, and if you feel like you hit it, we'll just move on to the next one, and then I think we'll have time for add-on questions right after that.
Great. What is the status of the Ramada Inn Permanent Supportive Housing Project? So I know you all are familiar with that. That is Shangri-La, which is a private developer, is purchasing that property. They will contract with Step Up, which is a nonprofit, to deliver services there. And that project will be 50 units for people who are chronically homeless and 50 units for veterans. That property is set to close any day, literally any day now. The complicated commercial real estate transaction, but it is closing imminently. And as soon as that happens, we will certainly send a press release out, be sure that word gets out in the community. I know that they are also working with an architecture firm right now on the renovation plan. So the main renovation that will happen there is they'll add kitchenettes into those hotel rooms to convert them into efficiency apartments. So we will know more once they get through their architectural phase. We'll know more about the projected timeline for occupancy. We don't quite have that yet. Point in time count. Does the homeless plan have anything to do with panhandling? If not, who should? No, I mean, what I would say about panhandling relevant to my sphere is, number one, it is a good chance for outreach folks to connect with people who clearly don't have all of their needs met and help them identify different ways that they can meet those needs. Number two, this is not exactly the question, but what I'll say is, I always encourage people not to give money to folks who are panhandling. When people are asking for money, people ask for money for a variety of reasons. They might need a bus ticket, they might need some drugs or alcohol, they might need to do laundry, like wide variety of reasons. But the reason that I would encourage people not to give money to folks who are panhandling is that it's not a solution to their experience of homelessness. What we want is to end homelessness. We want to solve the problem. And it is not possible that my $2 and your $2 and somebody else's $2 are going to get squirreled away until they have enough money for a security deposit and a first month's rent. So I always encourage folks to instead direct resources to programs and agencies that can be providing those solutions.
I got a question here, Susan.
Yes, I live downtown, and the Downtown Association had a program called Spare Change for Real Change for many years. And I think the biggest problem with it, I was on the board for a long time there. And I think the biggest problem with it was, if it's not enforced, it's, that it does, nothing changes. The other problem is the hotels. We wanted to put little, what do you call those little cards, the stand-up cards in hotel rooms, and the hotels were like, no, we don't want people to know we have a homeless problem. It's like, they know.
Secrets.
But I do think that has been tried, and I think it does work in some places, but it requires multiple levels of enforcement and participation. So just my comment.
Yeah, I grew up, I'm from Mars Hill. I grew up here and moved around for a while, and I moved back in 2009, and I did a year of AmeriCorps at the city in the same office I'm currently in. That first year I was back, and I wrote the copy for Spare Change for Real Change. That was my first job, activity when I was in that role in 2009. And I actually was just on an email chain today with Vic Isley and Kit Kramer about that same idea. This is the thing that is happening in other communities. Is that worth exploring here? And I gave them similar feedback to what you just said, which is, I think that has been tried here. It was not exactly successful, but it's a different climate now. There might be a way to innovate and to do that differently. So maybe worth a conversation. Do you have any influence on homeless repeat offenders, arrest convictions? I don't exactly understand this question. I don't know. I'm happy to try to answer it, but do you know if the person who asked is on the call?
Anybody want to raise their hand to clarify this question?
I will.
Sharon?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Sharon. I manage a commercial property on 4 Southtown Road. And we have had I have had a huge amount of problem with repeat offenders of snatch and grab. I've been assaulted 3 times, and I have been told by officers that some of these people that I'm calling them on have been, who are homeless, have been arrested 50 times or more. And my question always is, what part of 50 doesn't land you 6 months in county jail? And I have a terrible, terrible situation down there, which I may or may not bring up later or send an email to you, with camps in the back of the shopping center. And so it's just over and over and over again, the same people all the time that come in and snatch and grab. And it's just the police go, well, there's nothing we can do.
Yeah, I'd say 2 things about that. One is I think that the sort of determination around those things, around what gets prosecuted and all that, those are really questions for the DA's office. Even the police don't have, you know, much ability to direct that. But the second thing I would say is that in the past, there has been a familiar faces meeting, it's called, at the jail, that is folks who, exactly what you're describing, people who are arrested repeatedly. And there's been this kind of case conferencing group that has come together to try to troubleshoot, you know, what's happening with this individual and how do we get them stable and how do we get this situation to change. I think that there is plenty of opportunity for us to better coordinate around that. And that's multiple fold, you know, that is partly like a lot of folks in those situations. A lot of what's behind that is behavioral health, so mental health or substance use disorders. People get real desperate and they're willing to do really ugly things. And so can we help address the thing that's making them desperate? That's part of the problem solving work to do. That is different, I think, from the question you're actually asking, which is related to justice and, you know, how do we hold people accountable? I would say I don't know that I have much ability to influence that. But I think that is an ongoing conversation between APD and the Sheriff's Department and the DA's office.
Alan, I see you have your hand up.
Emily, I've been volunteering at Rescue Mission for over 10 years and serving food for the homeless on the streets who aren't using the existing shelter there. First of all, why is Rescue Mission not part of the HMIS reporting system?
I think, well, I would never want to speak for Michael Woods. I have an excellent relationship with him, but I would never want to speak for him. But I think he has wanted some case management functionality that he has thought HMIS wasn't able to provide. I think we can actually do that in the system. And then 2 is, I think, kind of connected to what I was saying earlier about just needing to rebuild some trust and rebuild the system. I think he's not felt very, very supported or valued by kind of the homeless service system as a whole. And so not been as inclined to participate in those sort of community-wide initiatives. That's absolutely a thing that we're working on, though that kind of underlying thing is something that we're working on that he and I are in conversation about, but also he does use a database that it's kind of parallel to the particular software that we use for HMIS. And so he is open to if we can develop a patch that will export his data that we can then import into HMIS, he is open to that. And because we have a common vendor, I'm in conversation with that vendor around the technical aspects of that to see what might be possible. So I think that there's some opportunity to get his data into our community-wide data, but it's going to be a bit of a process.
I noted that your count, your census every year has increased by 21% in 2022. We feed, at least when I'm there, every 3rd Tuesday, about 100 people who are street-based homeless. And I just think that the you've undercounted based on what I see just at one agency. But that's just an observation that I'm making from working there. That's,
Yeah, I mean, I think,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
I think we have, in the past, we have sent volunteers to do a count at the rescue mission on that same night, in addition to getting the data from their system for the folks who are going to spend the night there. And I, I mean, you would know better than I am because you're actually there, but I think a lot of folks who end up coming for meals there may not end up sleeping outside that night. Like there may be people who do find that buddy with a couch where they do have a place to stay, but they're certainly not stable, don't have housing security, don't have food security, but wouldn't meet that federal definition of literal homelessness, and so wouldn't be included in that count.
Okay, let's keep going.
Do you believe that the city and county can come to one system and one set of policies? Is that one homeless service system? Well, I guess I would ask, is there any clarification around that question?
I think I recall a discussion where there's not one phone number to call if somebody is experiencing homelessness. You got to go different to if they're just outside the city limits and they're in the county. And someone was explaining to me, and maybe this was in the focus group, where during the day, the unhoused come into the city to obtain services sometimes, but where they're sleeping at night is in the county. And so the city's ability to work on that, doesn't really work.
I'll say, I guess I will just speak sort of to the relationship between the city and the county when it comes to homelessness. My understanding from kind of pre-pandemic, which is again, I was at Homeward Bound in that time, not a city employee, but my understanding is that the city and county have not always had a strong relationship, probably on many fronts, but I'm sure including homelessness. I do feel really positive about where we are right now. Certainly at my level, there are really strong staff relationships. And I think this project with the National Alliance to End Homelessness that we are both involved in, along with Dogwood Health Trust, again, is really sort of creating a platform that we can continue to build on when we move into implementation of those strategies and recommendations. So the county provides a number of services that folks who are homeless interact with, and also provides a lot of funding to homeless service providers. So I want us to be in lockstep as we're approaching homelessness in our community, because we are, again, a single community with a single homeless population. We've got to be able to work on that together.
Okay, the next one is about Greenville and why it seems to be better off.
I don't know. What I will tell you about this is I think that is the kind of thing that our team can look into. Greenville does seem like a good sort of comp for us to evaluate as a community. I went to college in Greenville and I volunteered at a day center when I was there, and have maintained some contact with the folks at that agency, but that has been a very long time ago now. And I'm certainly not current on what's happening in Greenville. So I just don't know the answer to that.
This one is about where Code Purple and shelters are located, and especially when they are in the midst of a residential area.
I don't want to get too technical about the wording here, but I don't know that it's possible to include a policy. That's probably partly a zoning conversation. I will say, and I will say that I understand that we need shelters to be located in an area that does work for that neighborhood, and that we have a lot of work to do on that front with existing shelters. And we certainly learned a lot of lessons from that at the Ramada. So a lot of opportunity to do a better job in integrating that. I don't know that I can really say, speak to that much more at this point, but I do take the point that we need to ensure that service provision to folks who are homeless is not a threat to neighborhoods.
Okay. I know this one comes up a lot in general conversation. How many of the homeless are from around here versus somewhere else?
So the best data that we have on this is from those supplemental questions that we asked during the point in time count this year of people who were unsheltered. And Rick, I'm sorry, could you share, do you have that slide, those slides pulled up or no?
I can. Correct. Where roughly would you like me to go?
Probably like 3/4 of the way down. Yep, a little further. Here, so this next section. So these are the questions that we asked of folks who are unsheltered. So keep in mind that of the 637 people who were identified as homeless, 232 were unsheltered. One of the questions for unsheltered folks was, when you last had housing, where was it? And 57% of people said Asheville, meaning they were folks who were living in housing in Asheville, lost that housing, became homeless in Asheville. 13% of people were in Western North Carolina, but not in Asheville. So in surrounding counties, just under 5% were elsewhere in North Carolina. And then 24% of folks were in another state, meaning that they were homeless when they came to our community. If you look down at the bottom left corner there, that's based on 166 responses out of the 232 people who were unsheltered. So again, participation is voluntary in this survey, but that slide that's on the screen there is the best data that we have across the community.
I think you talked about high cost of living and hence lack of affordability already, so that's pretty obvious. We come back to panhandling again. Where would you direct us to talk more about panhandling? Is that city attorney? Is it the laws? Is it the ordinances? Do you know where we should go?
I would say city attorney. I think that's exactly right. There is, I'm sure y'all know this, there is an ordinance. That's what you're referencing here. So there is an ordinance around panhandling. My understanding is that it's not actually possible to make panhandling illegal because it has been previously deemed by courts, and I don't know where, not in Asheville, that this is an expression of free speech, and so not possible to make it illegal. What the ordinance describes in the city is some of the kind of associated difficult behaviors. So continuing to ask after someone's already said no, like being really aggressive in those interactions, those kinds of things are described. But yes, I think city attorney is best source of legal information around what is and is not possible.
Okay. The next three are really about camping and sleeping out, and what should the community do when they observe that, and sort of, I guess, who should we hold responsible? Is there one number to call, and who should we think of as being held responsible for this kind of thing?
So first thing I would say about camps right now, again, connected to increase in the population and drastic decrease in the inventory available, is that largely there just is nowhere for people to go right now. So that doesn't mean that a camp needs to be in your front yard, but it does mean that like our service system is really lacking in the capacity to get people inside. So therefore we have people camping. We have a few things in motion around this. One, as I said earlier, I am working with service providers on adding that bed capacity back in, working on a good Code Purple plan, just trying to develop options that will create places for people to go that will sort of decrease the number of folks who are outside. As I mentioned earlier, the city funds 2 outreach positions at Homeward Bound, and those folks are a good resource if you are engaging with someone who's camping. They are people who can come out and be a support to both you and to the folks who are camping, and try to get those people connected with resources. What they can't do is just put those folks in their car and take them to a solution, because that doesn't exist in our community at the moment. We've got to continue to work to build that out. But they can help problem solve, can help de-escalate situations, can help with some of those interactions. I can put that contact info in the chat. Is that the best way to do that? Or I can send it to you, Rick, to share?
Send it to me. Send it to me. Sharon, you had a comment?
Yes, Emily, Homeward Bound does not help on my private property where I have had many camps and tents and people pass away from ODing. Homeward Bound will not come out. It's private property. So I'm sorry, but I've tried to reach out to Homeward Bound and they do not answer the phone. They do not return their calls. They have been no help at all. The only thing I have been able to do is have to call the police, have them go out with me. I have to pay to have someone tear everything out, tear it down. And this happens, Emily, on a weekly basis for me. And this is no joke. Mm-hmm. So, and when because I'll talk incessantly about this, as everybody knows, everything on here is great for the people that are out there, but it's not doing a darn thing for all of the businesses that are impacted by this horrible situation that's occurring in our community. It seems to be people-based for the people that are on the streets, and I'm in agreement with that, but it's not dealing with how it's impacting our businesses everywhere. So that's my 2 cents, and just FYI that Homeward Bound does not help.
Yeah, well, a few things on that. I would love to hear more about that Homeward Bound experience. That's a good thing for me to follow up on. They are outreach, they're not enforcement. So that may be part of what you're experiencing, but certainly they should be able to come. They're absolutely able to come to private property. So certainly they should be able to come out and talk to you and talk to the folks there. And I'd be happy to make that happen, help broker that connection. The other thing I'll say is that you're right. You know, certainly my job is really specific to ending homelessness, is to working on how our community can best end homelessness. And I understand that that is different than, than really specifically mitigating the effects on community members and business owners who are experiencing that. What I will say is that those things do work together. And I know that that's not immediate comfort, and that, a lot of what I'm describing is kind of a long game, is building our community's response system so that we're not stuck like we are right now. And so eventually, just like eventually homelessness, has snowballed to have this really challenging effect on you all and on folks across our community, eventually that system should snowball into effectiveness so that that really decreases the number of folks who are outside and the effect that you're experiencing. But again, I know that is not what you need today. I understand that.
Alan, then Barbara.
Tom Lair.
Sorry. Oh God. Sorry.
Go ahead, we hear you, Alan.
Yeah, I just became aware of another problem similar to what Sharon's experiencing, and that's because of our city policy of pushing people off of public property and then into private areas. My house of worship owns a cemetery, fairly large cemetery. It's been around for a number of years. And just last week, we became aware of an encampment on the cemetery grounds, which are enclosed by fencing. And this is the second or third time that I've been told that this problem is occurring. I'm a board member of that house of worship and member of the security team. So I've been involved in that issue, but it's a serious problem. And I'm not sure what the solution is, but every time you have law enforcement pushing people off of public property, which they shouldn't be on, in parks and so forth, they're looking for the easiest place to encamp where they're not going to be harassed. Unfortunately, that shouldn't be a cemetery. That's a sacred place and for us, and we're really troubled by it. That's just a comment.
Barbara.
Thank you, Rick. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, so I was wondering what you do, Emily, to bring in other city departments like sanitation and the health director, particularly sanitation. I think we're all really tired of seeing the trash up and down Tunnel Road, pretty much everywhere under the bypasses. And when I've reported that several times, that needs to be looked at. And what I'm seeing is that means more shopping carts go down to those areas, and then they're filled with trash, but nobody's emptying them. So what I've also seen along that area is then the rats come in. So I think we run into a health sanitation issue without a doubt. And I'm sure the city sanitation department, those people that work in there seem to take their jobs very seriously and try to keep our neighborhoods clean. But do they have some input to you all on how that situation can be remedied?
Yes, so Jess Foster is the sanitation manager, and she and I are in regular communication. I think for them, it's been a capacity issue. There's been such an increase in the amount of litter and cleanup connected to camps has been it's just a significant expansion of the work that they need to be doing. They did, through the ARPA funding process, the American Rescue Plan Act funding process, there were some new resources allocated to sanitation to expand their capacity. So they're working on that now. And I know that that community cleanup is a priority for the city in general. Certainly there are a lot of cleanliness opportunities that we have. So there are some initiatives in the works. I am peripheral to that. We have some locations in common and some calls in common, but the actual response of logistics and capacity around doing the cleanup, I'm certainly not involved in any of that. But I would say that there is pretty significant effort in the sanitation division and from city management in adding some resources there.
Well, that truly would be wonderful, because even with trying to clean up an area, which many people have done, then it all just shows back up. And I think the thing that's very disturbing for people in general right now is the amount of needles that are on the sidewalks and laying in the streets and wherever. So that definitely could be looked at. And I was wondering along the same line as pulling in other resources, do you all ever talk to the Target and Lowe's and Ingles to see about what can be done to get their shopping carts back on their property for use in the business like they're supposed to be? And is a possibility of a solution to that would be to make carts available for the homeless people through some of those grants?
I don't know. I've not been involved in any conversation like that. I honestly am not sure if anyone at the city has had those conversations. I do know from the shelter initiative at the Ramada that some of those larger businesses, like you named, Walmart and Target, will sometimes come pick those up if there is if you have a handful of those in one location, then they'll send someone out to pick those up because they are expensive. And so that's an asset for their store that they want to hang on to. But I am not sure if there's kind of large scale conversation happening around how to get those cards where they belong.
Okay, just a couple more things. On the different groups, is everybody using the same computer system? Like I know when I was at Eblin and we used Advantage and the Hot Mission was using Advantage. Is everybody on that same program? Because it does let you see if somebody's trying to use duplication of funds.
Absolutely not. And absolutely, that is the goal. So the homeless management information system is the database that a number of providers are participating in, and that we are working on continuing to improve, because you're right, it makes service delivery more effective across the board if people have access to that shared data.
Yes, and I will say respectfully, it is hard to be poor or homeless, especially to access services. For example, when a person comes in to get, let's say, rental assistance, whether it's through the EA program or the LEAP program or any of that. But then they say, I need some diapers for my baby. Is there any food available? And so they have to get around to different agencies or different areas of town to get help. Is there a possibility? And I know we looked at this about 7 years ago of maybe doing a one-stop shopping type place. At that point, it was mentioned maybe Innsbruck Mall, and of course that went by the wayside, but where they could come, have different access to those agencies there, but also some computers to go look for jobs and, kind of everything right there. And I don't know what all you're putting in the Days Inn as far as offices, but that could be a possibility. And it's not have it just be for the people who are going to reside there, but the people that need to access services. Because truly, if you're staying on the street corner and somebody says you need to go to ABCCM or Eblin or whatever that, you may as well be talking a foreign language.
Yeah, I think that's the right idea. And I think that we're not currently in a place to pull that off in our community, but I think that it's the right move to be working on better coordination among services in general, and identifying like, where are folks getting lost along the way? Where are they falling through the cracks, and how do we tighten that up? I remember that Innsbruck Mall conversation. I will say about the Days Inn that is permanent supportive housing, so an apartment complex, and certainly the goal is not to have additional folks coming there for services, but that property is really intended to be a home for people who live there. But I think your point is right, that we have opportunity to better coordinate services across community providers.
Well, I would encourage you to look at
Barbara.
Yeah.
We're just about out of time.
Okay.
So if you could hang on to a couple of those, that'd be great.
Yeah, let me wind up. It would be great to look at the TDA funds for that possibility from the hotels. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah.
Let me mention, I realized I didn't answer the Lexington under the 240 bridge in Merriman. Let me just mention briefly that we are part of the strategy of the city right now is looking at where there are real hotspots, and that spot under the bridge on Lexington is a great example of that, and trying to really problem solve around that specific location. So there is work happening on that area in particular.
So we've been at this for nearly 90 minutes. I was looking ahead on the questions. A bunch of them have been answered, especially about point in time count and children and that sort of thing. If I would pick one more that I would ask you to take a shot at, and then we'll call that a day for verbal, and maybe we can get some written answers at a later time when you have all that spare time you have. It would be the last one that talks about once Days Inn and Ramada get renovated and become permanent supportive housing, the claim here is that there'll be 300 plus units of permanent supportive housing between ABCCM and those. If those are all up and running, is that what we need? Or is there more that we need?
Well, let me clarify the count in this question, first of all, so there won't be over 300 units of permanent housing in East Asheville. ABCCM's Veterans Restoration Quarters has 50 units of permanent supportive housing for veterans. They've had those a number of years. I couldn't tell you exactly how long, but a number of years. Those are often for folks who have been through the program at the VRQ and have responded really well in that kind of community environment and have wanted to stay in that location. And then also the project at Beloved is not actually for folks who are homeless. So that is 12 tiny homes. It is intended for very low income people who are housing insecure, but it is not a project that is dedicated to folks who are homeless. Homeward Bound will have 85 units, and the projection at the Ramada is about 100 units. That property has 115 rooms or 113 rooms and 2 apartments. And so again, they're working through architecture right now. And so I don't know exactly where that will land until they get through that process, but we're anticipating that will be around 100 units total at the Ramada. So that is, what's that math? 235 units, first point of clarification there. But second thing I would say is we don't, at this point, we don't have a target number of permanent supportive housing units that we are aiming for. We want to be really data driven in our strategy, but also, the city is not a developer, is not creating these particular supportive housing units, is a funder in both of those projects at with Homeward Bound and with Shangri-La. But kind of when we look at overall community strategy and our continuum of care and the work of the Homeless Initiative Advisory Committee and bringing our service providers together, what I want is that we do get to a point where we have really strong data about the need in our community and can quantify how many units of permanent supportive housing we need right now based on the population we have, but also get sophisticated enough in our data collection and analysis so that we can project how many units of permanent supportive housing we will need on an ongoing basis. We'll certainly always need new permanent supportive housing projects in the community because again, if a permanent supportive housing project is successful, it doesn't have a lot of turnover, people do stay housed, and there will continue to be new people in our community who have severe needs and need that level of service in order to not be homeless. So I can't give you a number right now, but can say that I want us to, work together as a system to really get clear about our need and then let that shape our strategy.
Okay. Any last questions before we call it a wrap for the night? Okay, I think you've worn them out, and I suspect we've worn you out. Emily, thanks.
I'm sorry, I think Kathy had a question.
Oh, I just wanted to recognize that, to me, it's just disturbing the number of homeless and the increase, just recognizing that, that exists. And, and appreciate, and I know it's a complex problem, but, it is just it is disturbing to see the numbers increasing.
Okay, I'll work with Emily to go through the questions that were submitted that we didn't really have time to get answers for, and if she'll fire me an email back at some point in time, I'll post that and let everybody know. Emily, thank you for stretching yourself into the 7:30 plus time frame. I think CAN is doing what it can to participate in this. And if there's anything that the neighborhood communities can do to help you build the relationships you need to pull all this data together, if community can put pressure on the other providers and that sort of thing in any constructive way, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll bring it before our board and see if there's things we can do so that
we know in real time what's really going on. And lots of people have said to me they want transparency in how the programs are being effective. And I know we would get that better if everybody was participating in the HMIS.
Yeah, I'll say I think we are really headed in that direction. I want to be really clear that I again have a good relationship with Michael Woods. We are working on how to get rescue mission data incorporated. And I also have been working with the folks at the VA Medical Center about how we can make that happen. And those are our two big data gaps in terms of service provider participation. We got a lot of work to do on quality of data across all service providers right now, but I do think that we're headed in a good direction. But I appreciate that. I think that we need you all to be part of a number of solutions. That's how we get this done, is that we all figure out a way to participate. And so I would love to continue to be in conversation with all of you. And I appreciate that opportunity to be here with you tonight.
All right. Well, thanks.
Thank you very much. That was
Thanks,
really
everybody.
informative.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your work.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.